in town. I mean, the biggest show in the whole world. Starts in a few minutes. No waiting. Tickets only 1 penny. All right, music.
Hi, everyone. The program live will begin in about 4 minutes. If you're watching this on demand, you can fast forward to the start of the show, which will begin in about 4 minutes. If you're listening to us on Ripon Common Sense Radio, please take this time to say hello in the chat. And if you're tuned in on Rumble rant to us. Again, the program will begin in just about 4 minutes.
And the only way to reach them is to scare them. But of that, you know little, I suppose.
Also, now is a chance for you to join us live in the VIP Backstage Lounge. If you haven't done so already, you can visit meet.riponrabbithole.com. That's MEET.RIPONRABBITHOLE.com. Big top hats and a shout out to all of you joining us there tonight in the Backstage VIP Lounge. We'll be there with you in just a few moments as we're getting just a slightly unconventional start to the show. You know how I like to be right on time? Well, we're running just a little bit short. So we're getting everything set together for you. And I look forward to seeing you in just a moment.
In the back streets of the city, he would shuffle, while spinning on his heels and chewing beef. He'd promise her he'd be a vegetarian, but he could not control his lust for meat. Some say she left the streets for greater glory, but others said that she was big with child. Whatever was the truth, it did not matter. He would hunt her down and cut her with his smile. Last time he was seen was by...
Oh yeah, Captain Pete in the house.
He traded 2 gold teeth for a sack of corn, and he would plant it on the outskirts of the city as a warning that he would someday return. He said he never found her, and he's still looking. It is said he searches rivers for some sign, but the truth is that he caught her down in Georgetown with a Spaniard who had left his wife behind.
Where you going? I don't know, but I'm on my way.
Ripon Rabbit Hole is a community-driven radio. At times the community comments may reveal prejudices and other beliefs that we or our sponsors do not condone. Views or opinions expressed by the community, callers, or guests, are those of the individual speaking and do not represent the views or opinions of this site. Ripon Common Sense content is intended for mature audiences only. Enjoy. The captain has turned on the seatbelt sign.
Let's do it. Good evening and welcome to another episode of the Ripon Rabbit Hole Live Show. I'm your host, AJ, the Ripon Rabbit. Give yourselves a round of applause for being smart enough to be here. Tonight we're diving deep down the rabbit hole, not just into forgotten history, but into the soul of a town that stood its ground against injustice. A town in central Wisconsin that said, no, not here, not in Ripon. You may have heard of the Underground Railroad. You may know names like Harriet Tubman. But how many of you know the name Oscar LaGrange or Sherman Booth or how the citizens of Ripon once risked arrest, social ruin, and even their lives to protect a man who refused to let the federal government legislate his morality. This is the story. So buckle up your seatbelts, folks, as we explore Ripon's Booth War, a stand for freedom. That's tonight, Friday, May 30th, 2025. The year is 1884. The snow falls quietly over the village of Ripon, Wisconsin. Smoke curls from chimneys. Children walk to school bundled tight and trying just to stay warm. But there's something darker in the air, heavier than the winter wind of Wisconsin. And it's not just the cold people are bracing against. It's fear. Fear that freedom, once taken for granted in the North, is slipping. And at the heart of the town, beneath the quiet surface of daily life, a storm is brewing. One that will pit neighbor against neighbor, city against state, and principle against law. The rabbit hole goes deep on this one, folks, and we'll get through it together tonight. But first, my top hat's off to all of you joining us on a Friday night. My, oh my, how time does fly. It's great to see each and every one of you gathered back there in the backstage, and I came in just a little bit late, but Julie Seeger is there. Julie Seegers, great to see you with Captain Pete. Amanda, good evening and welcome back. Wetzel in the backstage VIP lounge with Screech Owl Scott, SOS, Jenny, and Corey B. My, oh my. Can you believe it's almost summer? I'm looking forward to tomorrow being the last day of May. I can't wait for June. Put a 100 in the chat room if you can't either. Are you as excited as I am to get this summer kicked off? I can tell you what, I am ready. After the weekend we had last weekend, I want nothing but warm sunshine. 100's coming in from Jenny. Julie with applause. I know. I'm ready. I'm right there with you. I sent out through our email blast and our text message a little blurb today about the newspaper article that was written and published as an editorial in the Ripon Commonwealth Press this week. And I put together my thoughts and I published that together on Ripon Rabbit Hole along with my thoughts of this interesting editorial titled R.I.P. GOP 1854 to 1825. This was written by the former editor of the Ripon Commonwealth and also the former owner whose father owned the Ripon Commonwealth. But what's really cool about the Ripon Commonwealth is that it was around back in 1854. The Ripon Commonwealth Press is the oldest living newspaper in Ripon. And I can tell you that this article is going to turn your stomach if you're like me reading it, because it's all about how the rest in peace of the Republican Party. And rightfully so. Some people can argue that, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the Republican Party, especially the RPW today. And that work begins with education. That work begins with understanding our roots and our foundation and where we came from, not just as a Republican Party, not just as a Democrat or an independent or a libertarian today, but us as people, us as Americans living in 2025. And I can tell you the first few sentences of this really ticked me off enough to put together some of my own thoughts. And I published that on the Ripon Rabbit Hole, included a link to the entire article. But he starts off this editorial, which is his right to do so, by saying, would the next person to leave Ripon's Little White Schoolhouse please turn out the lights and lock the door? The Republican Party, as we have long known, it is dead. And I can tell you, it may appear that way to some. In fact, it could appear that way to many. And if you joined us last week for the Ceresco episode, I focused on a decade, 10 years prior to what took place on the night of March 20th in the Little White Schoolhouse. And if you have not heard that episode, I strongly encourage you to go back and find it on demand and listen to it, because it helps give perspective as to our roots, as to where we came from, how we got to where we are today. And it's my aim that tonight's episode, in the story I'm about to tell that took place after the Little White Schoolhouse and after that March 20th evening that sparked our very favorite freedom flame. Now, one could say that tonight's story all began with a law, or a few laws. We're going to look at the Missouri Compromise of 1820. It was passed to maintain the balance between free and slave states. And as Missouri entered the Union as a slave state, Maine was actually admitted as a free state. So the Missouri Compromise of 1820, it banned slavery north of the 3630 latitude line in the Louisiana Territory, except for Missouri. And then comes the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. It was an extremely controversial federal law passed as part of the Compromise of 1850. And it was designed to appease southern slave-holding states. And the purpose was to strengthen the earlier fugitive slave laws, especially the ones from like the 1700s, by making it easier for slaveholders to recover escaped slaves, even if they fled into Wisconsin or other free states. And this actually mandated cooperation. It required citizens and local officials in free states to assist in the capture and the return of escaped slaves. And if you refused this, and if you refused to help, or you were aiding a runaway slave, that could result in some heavy fines, man, or maybe even imprisonment. And it didn't even come with any kind of a jury trial. Just alleged fugitive slaves were actually denied a trial by jury. Instead, a special commissioner decided each and every slave's fate. And commissioners were paid anywhere from $10 for returning a person to slavery, but only $5, half of that, if they ruled in favor of freedom, which led to extreme accusations of bias. And of course, it targeted free black people. It opened the door, actually kicked open the door, for kidnapping free black individuals in the North, since anyone could claim a person was a runaway slave and didn't even have to show much evidence, very minimal evidence at that. And the law was deeply unpopular in Wisconsin and throughout the North, and it literally added fuel to abolitionist sentiment and increasing tensions between the North and the South, which ultimately grew into the Civil War. And it also led that more active resistance, including the Underground Railroad. And throughout that period of time, there were violent rescues and state-level personal liberty laws that were aimed at nullifying the federal law. So the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, it played a absolutely crucial role in heightening the conflict and helped push the nation towards the Civil War. It highlighted divisions, both political and moral, in the country over this key issue of slavery. But then in 1854, along comes the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and it was sponsored by a Senator Stephen Douglas, and it repealed the Missouri Compromise by allowing settlers in Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery, a concept that was largely known as popular sovereignty. And it, for the most part, effectively nullified the 3630 line, and it opened up new territories to the possibility of slavery. So violence erupted, like big time, in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers known as Bleeding Kansas. And Bleeding Kansas also has very deep roots to Ripon and the men that were in and around the area in that time. And I'm going to do a full-on episode upcoming in the future on Bleeding Kansas. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it deepened these divisions, and it angered most of the people in the North, and it helped give a real rise to the Republican Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery. But it was also a very major step towards the Civil War. So while the Missouri Compromise was in 1820 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 undid it and reignited the national debate over slavery, the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 mandated that all citizens, even in free states, assist in the capture of returned escaped slaves. And basically what this did is it criminalized compassion. But more important, it deputized ordinary people into becoming unwilling enforcers of slavery. And for many in the North, particularly in Wisconsin, mostly in Ripon, it was the last straw. And we've talked about Sherman Booth, who was an editor of the Milwaukee Free Democrat. We talk about him every year around the Freedom Flame because he was a fiery abolitionist who didn't just write about freedom, he actually acted on it. So when Joshua Glover, who we speak about every March as we lead up to the Freedom Flame, and we consider Joshua Glover to be a major spark in the flame of freedom, he was a runaway enslaved man, but was captured and jailed. And Booth organized an incredible mob of up to 5,000 people to break him free. That act of defiance, what I or anybody else could very well consider a insurrection after looking at how January 6th was painted. That act of defiance would spark national headlines and place Booth at the center of an incredible legal, political, more important, moral firestorm that would lead him straight into a jail cell and right into the arms of Ripon's resistance. But it was the Booth War that was not fought with bullets or bayonets. It was actually fought with conscience, with community, and with a very steadfast belief that liberty isn't handed down by politicians. It's upheld by ordinary people who choose to do what's right, even when it's not what's legal. So let's go back to Ripon. The sleighs lined up outside of City Hall, the printing presses turning out defiant headlines, and a young man named Oscar LaGrange who shook hands with U.S. Marshals using his left hand because he never wanted to not have his right hand available for reach. We hear of names like Edward Daniels and Alvin Beauvais, all Ripon residents that were very well associated with Sherman Booth. And we're going to get into the details and the statistics and the stories of these individuals, but one of the most favorite of them all is Edward Daniels. And he was a very crucial figure in Sherman Booth's escape story, as we're going to get into tonight, along with Alvin Beauvais and Oscar LaGrange. I mean, these men played a very important, a crucial role in keeping freedom alive. And it was all because the fugitive slave law of 1850 wasn't just another line in a law book. It was a declaration, and that's what these men believed. A declaration that the freedom you thought you had, the conscience you thought you could keep, was now a federal offense. And it gave the U.S. government power to reach into your town, your business, your church, whatever the case might be, and force you to become an agent of slavery. And in Wisconsin, we weren't having it. The law said that even in a free state, if a man or a woman had once been captured and enslaved, and their so-called owner came to the north to claim them, you had to help. You didn't have any other choice. You had to return that person to bondage. And if you didn't, you'd be fined and you'd be jailed. Imagine being told that man you helped feed, that one sleeping in your barn last night, he belongs to someone else. Imagine being told that your morality is illegal. That wouldn't sit too well, wouldn't you agree? Put 100s in the chat room if, oh, hell no, we're not going down that road. Because just like Sherman M. Booth, he couldn't imagine it either. Either could Oscar LaGrange or Edward Daniels or Alvin Beauvais. But Booth was the kind of man who printed truth in his papers, even if it threatened to scorch the paper, as 100's now coming in across the board. And in 1854, when the word spread that a man named Joshua Glover, a fugitive enslaved person, had been captured and was being held in a Milwaukee jail, Booth didn't just write an editorial. Heck no. He sounded the alarm, man. He rang the courthouse bell, quite literally, and led a mob of over 5,000 people to the jail to set Joshua Glover free. You want to talk about insurrection. They broke the door, they pulled Glover out, and they got him to safety along the Underground Railroad. But in that process, Booth became a total marked man. And the federal government charged him with violating that fugitive slave law. So he was arrested and thrown in jail. And that's when something absolutely extraordinary happened. Wisconsin didn't just protest, it resisted. Booth appealed his case to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and guess what? He won. The court declared that the fugitive slave law was absolutely unconstitutional. It was a direct challenge to federal authority. And for the first time in the U.S. history, a state Supreme Court had openly defied the federal government on the matter of slavery. And in Ripon, people were absolutely paying attention. And this young man, Oscar LaGrange, was one of them. So was Edward Daniels. So was Alvin Beauvais. And LaGrange, back then, was around 20 years old. He was educated, and he had some extreme principles. But he was not a politician. He was not a lawyer. He was just a simple man who knew that the law without justice is just tyranny in disguise. LaGrange didn't just support Booth. He worked alongside his friends to protect him. So on March 11th, 1854, just days before the Little White Schoolhouse meeting in Ripon, Wisconsin, down in Milwaukee, Booth had actually been arrested for aiding the escape of Joshua Glover. And he had been captured, like we talked about, under that Fugitive Slave Act. And Glover had made it to freedom before being seized and jailed and lived for 2 years in Racine. And Booth said, no way. When this guy got caught, he rallied up that public support by literally ringing the bells and gathering a huge crowd just so that they could break Glover out of jail. So very shortly after that night in March, Booth was then arrested because he was the marked man, and they threw him in jail in Milwaukee's Custom House, and that's where his rescue unfolded. And let me tell you, this was military precision operation. It was absolutely incredible because Booth's supporters, like Oscar LaGrange and Edward Daniels and Alvin Beauvais, worked behind the scenes. They weren't just thinking emotionally. They planned very strategically. As Booth secured a writ of habeas corpus from the Wisconsin Supreme Court challenging his imprisonment, Justice A.D. Smith reviewed the case and determined that the federal arrest warrant was irregular. So he dismissed the charges. And the state court declared that the fugitive slave law was unconstitutional and refused to honor federal authority. But despite that ruling, federal agents refused to release Booth. And that's when those tensions really mounted. And as the pressure built, LaGrange and others staged a completely clandestine fake rescue attempt in early July of 1860 to draw attention away from their real plan. In this farce demonstration that they held out inside of where he was held actually misled the federal guards into really tightening up security, but only briefly. And they did so in the wrong place. And that's when the real rescue took place on August 1st in 1860. They were disguised and had a little plan, and this small team of men, about 10 men, approached the courthouse around noon, and one of them presented the jailer with an absolutely blank card of admission, claiming that he was there and had official business with Booth. And as the jailer was completely distracted reviewing this fake card, his keys were taken right off his hip. And Booth's cell was then unlocked. Booth was absolutely fully dressed and ready to go and was escorted out. As the jailer was thrown in his cell and the door was locked. And Booth and Edward Daniels and Oscar LaGrange and Alvin Beauvais walked directly out the front of the door. No weapons drawn. No avert alarms raised. It was quiet. It was calculated. And it was brilliantly timed. Booth got into a waiting carriage, and he was whisked away from the scene without a single shot fired. The carriage took Booth to a train station on Chicago and Milwaukee, and the St. Paul Railway brought him right up to Ripon. Now, you can imagine this ticked off federal authorities. They were absolutely humiliated. Immediately issued a $100 reward for Booth's capture, and Booth had been absolutely publicly defiant, and his friends staged this mock courtroom proceeding and public readings of his speeches the day that they thought they were going to break him out. And that's when later he made that dramatic escape and even more, perhaps, dramatic appearance in Ripon. And throughout this time, he was giving speeches and he was drawing massive crowds. And federal marshals attempted to arrest him again in Ripon, but they were physically repelled by the local farmers. And at one point, a U.S. Marshal was actually thrown out of the building. Unreal. Absolutely remarkable to consider what took place just in the name of freedom. What an important period of time that's so often overlooked. It's unbelievable. It's absolutely mind-bending that this is not a story that they teach you in school. And when those federal marshals came up to Ripon hunting, Booth didn't run. Neither did LaGrange. In fact, they published public notice. To the marshals hunting me, I'll be at the Ripon post office at noon. Come and find me. And yes, he actually showed up. He rode in on a wagon of wheat, sat in plain view surrounded by farmers holding shotguns for prairie chickens. There is a lot more rabbit hole to explore as we come to the bottom of the first part of the Booth War program. Stick around. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back. Don't touch that dial. Are you enjoying the program so far? I know I am. Hopefully you're still with me, fellow travelers, and if your ears are tingling and your spine's a little straighter, that means you're feeling it too. The weight of this forgotten history pressing right up against our present. Sherman Booth, Edward Daniels, Alvin Beauvais, Oscar LaGrange sparked not just protest, but a prairie fire of principle. They weren't radicals, they weren't rebels, they were citizens, just like you and me, who said, enough is enough. And when the law said, do wrong or go to jail, they said, fine, lock the door. What interesting parallels our history we can derive, especially when it comes to today. And if you're around here at the Ripon Rabbit Hole and you're new to this place and you don't know how this works, we're here every Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday nights bringing you the very best of common sense radio, the Ripon Rabbit Hole. Screech Owl Scott takes to the airwaves every Wednesday night with We the People Wednesday, which is an interactive format show, gives you an opportunity to add your voice to the program and have your voice heard live on air starting at 8 p.m. each and every Wednesday night, as all shows do. Then come on back and wrap your head in tinfoil and be a part of the Tin Hat Nation each and every Thursday night as Screech Owl Scott leads the Tin Hat Thursdays. And I return Friday nights with another episode of the Ripon Rabbit Hole live show. If you didn't hear last week's program on Ceresco, I strongly encourage you to go back and listen, as what I've decided with this little mini-series leading into the summer of 2025 was to go a decade behind March of 1854, and I dove through the rabbit hole that is the 10 years leading up to the birth of the Republican Party. And now, as we're talking about the Booth War, we're talking about the decade that followed that little white schoolhouse meeting in Ripon, Wisconsin in 1854. Hopefully, this adds extra perspective to the entire story, so it makes it that much more important when we celebrate March 20th for the Freedom Flame celebration next year. If you haven't done so already, I encourage you to hop on over to our website, check it out, get familiar with the platform, and join us in the Backstage VIP Lounge. We'll return you back to tonight's topic, Ripon and the Booth War. You're listening to the Ripon Common Sense Radio Network, home of the Freedom Flame, RiponRabbitHole.com. That's right. Tonight's journey isn't just about the past. It's about courage. It's about that moment, quiet or loud, when you choose conscious over comfort. And believe me, the second half of this tale, it only gets wilder from here. Armed standoffs, secret escapes, presidential paperwork, and one last quote from LaGrange that'll hit you like a blast of cold Wisconsin January air. So hopefully your cups are refilled. If you're in a colder environment tonight, toss another log on that fire as we continue along this path. Because where we left, Sherman Booth had been broken out of jail. Oscar LaGrange and the gang was dancing circles around U.S. Marshals in Ripon. And the fugitive slave law, well, it was being tested like never before. It wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about what kind of country America really was. And so, where do battles like that go? As we know, to court. And Booth's case reached the Wisconsin Supreme Court, where the justices took a very bold and unprecedented step. They declared that the fugitive slave law in Wisconsin was unconstitutional. Now let that sink in. A state court saying no to the federal government. Sound familiar today? Huh? Because that was the first time it had happened in this country, and that ruling rocked the nation. And you got to remember, this was before the Civil War. The concept of states' rights had usually been a Southern argument for protecting slavery, but now a free state and the men and women of Ripon were using that same logic to fight it. It was absolutely brilliant. And the federal government, of course, they struck back. They took the case all the way to the United States Supreme Court, which quickly then reversed Wisconsin's decision, and they reserted the full power of the fugitive slave law once again, and reaffirmed that states had absolutely no authority to nullify federal legislation. No state judge or court has authority to issue a writ of habeas corpus to take a prisoner out of custody of the United States Marshals. That's literally what they said. So what did Wisconsin do? They ignored it. From a long time and for a while, the state stood by its ruling. It refused absolutely to hand Booth over. Judges refused to recognize these federal warrants. Even the governor refused to call out the militia to actually enforce the law. This was a full-on constitutional crisis, man. But it was in Ripon. It was in Wisconsin. And meanwhile, Booth was being shuffled from jail to jail, court to court, and every time he was locked up, a team of his supporters, usually led by these same men from Ripon, would rescue him and take him along the Underground Railroad and hide him or smuggle him out. And all the while, he kept publishing articles and giving speeches. And he even, at one point, rejected a presidential pardon, because that pardon came with a stipulation that unless he apologized, he couldn't be released. So he could be released as long as he apologized. And Booth said, I'm not going to do that. Because to Sherman Booth, saying sorry for standing up for freedom was a bigger crime than actually breaking the law. And I don't know about you, but I can make that correlation to Mr. Harry Waite today. And it could perhaps explain why Harry is not going to let this go. Because Harry's not sorry for standing up for freedom, just like Sherman Booth wasn't. And eventually, with the pressure mounting and the nation coming unraveled, President James Buchanan issued a limited release order in early 1861. In fact, it would be the last official paper that Buchanan ever signed before Abraham Lincoln took office. And it was a freedom order for Sherman Booth. But the law wasn't the only battlefield. The townspeople of Ripon, the farmers, the teachers, the students, they weren't done standing up. In fact, LaGrange's final act of defiance, a daring escape, and the chilling prediction that he made about what was coming next for the United States made really incredible sense. Because for Oscar LaGrange, the fight wasn't over after Sherman was released. If anything, things were just beginning, because Ripon was absolutely tense. Federal marshals were still circling and trying to round up anybody who defied them. And arrest warrants were issued, not just for Booth, but for anyone who had aided in his jailbreak, or harbored him, or publicly refused to cooperate. And that included Edward Daniels, Alvin Beauvais, and LaGrange. That included professors and blacksmiths and farmers, even teenagers with snowshoes. But LaGrange, he wasn't hiding anymore. Not really. He was leading, quietly, calculated, and careful. And he formed what he called an army of defense, which was a local network of friends, students, and fellow citizens that were ready to shield Ripon from any further federal intrusion. But no rifles, no violence, just watchful eyes and an absolutely unwavering resolve. But still, LaGrange began to wrestle with something a little bit deeper, a divide, actually, between rebellion and responsibility. And he believed in law. He believed in justice. But when it stood in conflict, what do you follow? What do you do? And in a moment of honesty, he much later wrote, quote, "I did not support Judge Smith's state rights decision, but I supported resistance to injustice. I didn't advocate rebellion. I advocated conscience," end quote. So one night, Booth confided him and basically said, maybe the only way to stop these marshals is to ambush them and maybe even kill them if that's necessary. And Oscar LaGrange refused. He didn't want blood in the snow. What he wanted was for the people to see and to think and to choose for themselves. And people did choose. At an octagon schoolhouse in Ceresco, citizens met there by gas lamps to plan protection. And when these federal agents came to arrest Alvin Beauvais, William Starr, Edward Daniels, Oscar LaGrange, the townspeople surrounded the homes in sleighs. And they actually formed a very human wall. And while Alvin Beauvais, yes, that Alvin Beauvais, the grandfather of the GOP, the founder of the Republican Party, was tricked into giving his word to actually appear in court, friends of his physically lifted him onto those sleighs and buggies and carried him away, because no one was going to jail without Ripon's permission. This wasn't lawlessness. This was something much deeper. This was a community standing not just for a man or for a case, but for the idea that freedom, once compromised, becomes a chain around all of us. So by early 1861, LaGrange wasn't dodging deputies anymore. He was actually training troops. He became the commander of the Ripon Rifles, which was a voluntary military unit preparing for the Civil War. And everyone now saw that that was a reality and it was on the horizon. And just before he left for camp in Racine, he received word the federal indictment against him had actually been dropped. And the United States attorney then, appointed by the new president, Abraham Lincoln, had filed it away. No further action, and just like that, he was off the hook. But what stayed with LaGrange wasn't the courtroom. It wasn't the politics. was the silence. The silence of people who once questioned him, who called him reckless, and who in the shadow of the Civil War finally admitted he was right. He had actually seen it coming. He had acted before it was popular, before it was safe. How's that? Isn't that a remarkable moral to stand on? In the end, the Booth War didn't end with a gunshot. It didn't end in flames or blood or even on a battlefield. It ended in something quieter, but perhaps just as powerful. It ended in remembrance. And years later, Oscar LaGrange, much older, settled, and perhaps a little bit more weathered, sat down and wrote about those days. And he didn't brag. He didn't grandstand. He reflected. He remembered. He admitted he had probably some more conservative thoughts and became a little bit more conservative with age than his younger years. That time had softened some of that fire, but not his belief, not his pride in what Ripon had done, and not his faith in what it meant, because it meant a lot. And he wrote these words, and I want to read them to you now. Slowly, let them land, let them sink in, because this isn't just a quote. It's a warning. More important, it's a promise. And I quote, "The experiences of a quarter of a century have made me more conservative than I was in 1861. But should I live a quarter of a century more, I know that I shall then, as I do now, thank God that no law subversive of human liberty can ever again be enforced in free America." Oscar H. LaGrange. Think about that. He lived to see the Civil War, the end of slavery, the birth of new amendments, and yet he still felt the weight of what he and his neighbors did back in Ripon. The marches, the standoffs, the classroom confrontations, the secret buggy rides and sleigh rides in the snow, and all of it done not for politics, not for profit, but for principle. And tonight, you've heard about this war that was fought without a battlefield. A war fought in newspapers and in courtrooms, in barns and behind blackberry thickets, and maybe most importantly, in the hearts of people who chose to live by the truth even when it wasn't legal. Pretty incredible when you think about it. And you need to stop and digest this. Maybe tomorrow or sometime next week, come back and listen to this episode all over again, because it's a lot of information for me to try to cram into an hour. And as we marched through these Underground Railroad tales, and we stood in the doorway of LaGrange, and we listened to Booth take on Wisconsin from his jail cell, we've seen a state court stare down the federal government and say, no, not here, not on our watch. So those who fail to understand or recognize history are doomed to repeat it. But now we need to ask the hard question of all of it. What does it matter? What's the point of telling the story if it just ends there, tucked away as footnotes or in history books, boxed up with yellowed newspapers and bronze plaques? Here's the thing. It doesn't end there. Not even close. Because Oscar LaGrange, Edward Daniels, Alvin Beauvais, toward the end of their lives, They all sat down and reflected on what they had done, on what they had risked, and what it all meant. Now, let's not lie to ourselves here. That line, it hits hard. And yeah, it's idealistic, but it also is a challenge. LaGrange wasn't just closing the chapter towards the end of that century of his life. He was daring the next one to live up to it. And we haven't always. You know that. I know that. We haven't always. America's story didn't magically get noble after the Booth War. There was a lot of blood. There were still chains. There were still people, generation after generation, fighting to be heard, to be counted, to be free. But Ripon matters. Booth matters. LaGrange matters. They all matter. Because they proved something fundamental about this country. Something we keep forgetting and having to keep remembering over and over and over again. That fight for liberty doesn't start in Washington. It starts in your town, your front porch, down your street. It starts when ordinary people, folks with no titles, no armies, no lobbyists, say enough. And it's worth asking, what have you done? If you were LaGrange, if you heard the knock at the door, if someone offered you silver to sell out your neighbor, would you take it? If the law demanded your obedience, like it has, but your conscience demanded defiance, did you choose it? Would you choose it again? That's legacy. Not just the names, not just the quotes, but the question. Because we're not done with those questions. No, my friends, not even close. And every time government overreaches, every time a neighbor or their rights are threatened, every time silence feels easier than speaking up, the Booth War should echo. And whether we hear it or not, whether we answer it or not, it says everything about the kind of people that we still are. Because the story that you're hearing tonight didn't just shape Ripon's past. It has a lot more to say about our future. Wouldn't you agree? And as we traveled back in time to the streets of Ripon and stood alongside this fascinating tale and watched as Wisconsin defied Washington with nothing but courage and conviction, I told a story of a war without bullets. A war where the battlefield was in the mind and the victory was based in character. That's the Booth War. A moment in time when the entire town, a real place with real people, decided the law wasn't enough. And if the law demands injustice, then it wasn't worth obeying. Think about that. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. We're not so far from 1854 as we like to think we are. We still live in a world where authority constantly demands compliance. Where speaking truth to power can absolutely come at a cost. It disturbs me to think where doing the right thing can look like doing the dangerous thing. And yet, there's something timeless about what took place and what happened in that era and in Ripon. because it reminds us that bravery doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, no, I won't betray my neighbor. No, I won't close my eyes. No, I will not trade principle for peace. What LaGrange and the boys did wasn't flashy. None of them actually ran for office. LaGrange and Booth didn't write a best-selling memoir. As far as I know, they didn't even leave a statue behind. But he left, and these men left a standard. And the question we have to ask, the one that history always leaves hanging in the air, is this. When that knock comes on your door, and when the sleighs are gone and the cameras are off, what will you do? Will you sell your soul for silver, or will you, like LaGrange, stand your ground? Because even if you're standing alone, it's worth it. Because that is the Booth War. Not just that it happened, but that it will and it can happen again. Not just people that resisted, but that we can too. The story isn't just about the past. It's a mirror for the present. It's a warning, a blueprint, perhaps a challenge. So let's end where we began. In the stillness of Wisconsin's winter, where the Liberty huddled in a circle of buggies, held not by muskets or legislation, but by our neighbors, who said simply, not here, not on our watch. That's the story. That's the stand. And that's the reminder for all of us. It's amazing to me. It really is. What I can learn and relearn myself every time I research these subjects in preparing to tell them to you. You know, if there's anything I've learned from walking through the pages of our past, it's this. The future doesn't build itself. It's not handed down like inheritance. It's carved out, chiseled by ordinary people like you and I, who choose to do extraordinary things, even when no one is watching. That story of Ripon isn't just something to admire from a distance. It's a call. It's a reminder that history doesn't just happen. It's made by the choices we make today. We live in a time of noise and division and distraction, a world where outrage is currency and apathy is sold as self-care. But here's the truth no algorithm wants to tell you. There is still power in principle. There is still value in virtue. And there still is hope, not just for survival, but for something better. And if Sherman Booth could risk everything, if Oscar LaGrange and Edward Daniels and Alvin Beauvais could risk everything for a man they barely knew, if Ripon could turn buggies into shields, then what's stopping us? We don't need a perfect plan. We don't need titles or uniforms or permission. We need conviction. We need community. We need each other. Because the same courage that lights lanterns in Ripon for the Freedom Flame still lives in front porches today. It's in the teacher who stands up for the truth in their classroom. It's in the business owner who puts value over profit. It's in the parent who teaches their child not just how to make a living, but how to make a difference. And yeah, it's in you and it's in I, right here, right now. The world doesn't need more spectators. It needs more neighbors, more bridge builders, more people who are willing to show up, not because it's easy, but because it's right. So let this be more than a story. Let it be a spark, a ripple, a reason to believe that small things, a word, a stand, a sleigh in the snow, still matter. The future we want, it starts with how we treat the person standing right next to us. It starts with courage to care when it's inconvenient. It starts with you and I. So let's go build. Let's go plant. Let's go love. Let's go stand with our community. Because if Ripon teaches us anything, it's that history favors the brave. But the future belongs to the good. That's why we have to keep digging. That's why we have to keep believing. And we have to remember the light ahead is always worth taking a stand for. And it might take time to get there. Understanding where we came from and where we're going, well, it's not an easy task. We can learn a lot from these stories, and understanding that just makes common sense. Wouldn't you agree? We did it! That's right, we spent another Friday night together. Give yourselves a round of applause for being smart enough to have been here. I hope you learned a little something and enjoyed this presentation this evening. As always, you can find the research materials at riponrabbithole.com. That's RIPONRABBITHOLE.com. There you can sign up for your exclusive backstage VIP pass. It's absolutely free to do so. It always will be. It's going to allow you to continue the conversation right now with us. You can feel comfortable about signing up with us at meet.riponrabbithole.com. Just put in your screen name, choose to share or not share your permissions, and come on in. We're going to have a complete conversation about this episode and all the topics that we've covered in the last few Friday Night Live shows. Screech Owl Scott will return next Wednesday starting at 8 p.m. Central Time with We the People Wednesday. Join him as he brings your voice to life live on air each and every Wednesday night. Then come on back and wrap your head in tinfoil for another Tin Hat Thursday. Starts again at 8 Central, as all shows do. And I will return again next Friday night with another Ripon Rabbit Hell live show. I hope you have a fantastic week ahead, that you get everything done that you wish to do, and you're ready to come back here and do it all over again with us. So, wherever you are, good morning, good evening, or good day, whatever the case may be. I'm AJ, the Ripon Rabbit. Until we meet again, take care of yourselves and each other. Good night.
There was an old man living in an old house down by the lake. Rumor says the man was hunting for rabbits just for fun. Since the day the rabbits disappeared for a while, then came back and cast a spell over the old man. So he looks like a rabbit too now.